This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari. Now, it's probably fair to guess that all of us like equality. Equality between races, equality of sexes, equality of treatment in front of the law, etc., etc. But what exactly is equality? And if everybody agrees that it's a great virtue, then why do people disagree so much about how to implement this virtue? These kind of questions occupy a lot of our discussion around social justice today, for example. And I'm not the right person to solve them in any way. But today's episode is an attempt to clarify the issue in a way that hopefully can show us some light towards possible ways forward. And our method is to take the long view of history, to look at where we come from. Where do our urges for equality come from? And where do our hurdles to equality come from? My guest is philosopher Prof Anderson from the University of Michigan, who's really one of the foremost thinkers on political equality in the world today. This is really a sweeping conversation where we start from our hunter-gatherer past, and we move through tribal societies, European Enlightenment, all the way to anarchism, Marxism, and social democracy. We discuss a lot of questions from where does our call for equality come from? Is it an invention of maybe European Enlightenment, or is it something rooted in human nature more deeply? If it is rooted in human nature more deeply, why do we have to keep on fighting for it? And if we do keep fighting for it, why is it so difficult to have people agree on what exactly are we striving for? I don't know if we have provided a good answer to the problem, but this was certainly a really clarifying and quite inspiring discussion for me to have. I hope you enjoyed. As always, there's a list of work and names mentioned in the conversation. You can find it in the show notes. So without further ado, I bring you Prof Anderson. Professor Prof Anderson, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
So you've become quite a star recently. I think one of the main reasons, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think is the way that you link philosophy to real social movements, to actual people organizing to make a more egalitarian future. Recently, you've also had another strand in your work, which is not about making a better future, but about taking the long view of history in understanding where do all these impulses that drive us sometimes towards equality, sometimes away from it come from. And I found this fascinating idea in one of your papers where you said that humans are both despotic and egalitarian by nature. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so this is an idea that I got from Christopher Bohm, who's a very important anthropologist. He wrote a book called Hierarchy in the Forest, The Evolution of Egalitarian Behavior. It's a really great book. It's a quick read. Everybody should read it. I think it's incredibly important because there are really two challenges that egalitarians have to work through. One is just figuring out what equality is. What are we after? What is that ideal of equality? And the second thing is we have to figure out why is equality so hard to achieve? And what Bohm argues is that we know that human beings are capable of living as equals because hunter-gatherers are an egalitarian, they have an egalitarian organization. At the level of the band, which is max about 80 people, but usually considerably smaller than that, all decisions concerning the band involve the deliberations of all of the adults. So everybody has a say. And furthermore, they reject relations of domination. So even if somebody is considered a wise deliberator about the fortunes of the band, that person can't just order other people around. Everything works by persuasion, right? You have to persuade others to go along with a certain plan.
Yeah, and I think what's really important is that there are always exceptions, and I know that a lot of people have their favorite exception to the rule of very egalitarian hunter-gatherers, but that's not really, I think, such an important point because we know that many, especially mobile hunter-gatherers do live in an egalitarian way. So yeah, okay, there might be one exception, especially with sedentary hunter-gatherers, but the main argument still stands, which is we are able to do it.
That's correct. It's the nomadic hunter-gatherers who are egalitarian. Now, part of it is they don't have much of a surplus. So you can't really have inequality of wealth because stuff is a pain to carry around. Right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, chimpanzees are not an egalitarian species in their typical social organization, and so it's not only about the lack of surplus. I guess it's also something that separates the typical nomadic hunter-gatherer.
Absolutely. So classically, we distinguish different dimensions of inequality. One has to do with authority. Can some people order other people around? Can they just tell them what they have to do and the other party has no say in the matter? So that's domination and subordination. A second dimension has to do with standing or who counts in the deliberations of the group. Do some people's interests count a lot more than others? That's where inequality of wealth comes in, because wealth, right, makes you count. You can pay people pay attention to you, right?
Hmm.
And you have the power through wealth to close off opportunities for others and to give them a powerful incentive to go along with what you want. And thirdly, there's inequalities of esteem, right? Are some people just honored more than others? Do they have more esteem than others? These three dimensions of inequality are linked causally, but they do vary somewhat independently. They're not all uniquely tied together.
Yeah, as a student of Chinese history, I loved your example of the eunuch slaves in the imperial courts as an example of having massive political power and basically zero esteem.
Yes, exactly. They were absolutely despised, just like disgusting beings. And of course, they had enormous power over all the subjects of the empire, but they were also utterly helpless before the emperor himself.
Yeah.
So we have these different dimensions of inequality, and a fully egalitarian society would, to the extent possible, minimize inequalities on all three dimensions. It's inevitable that some inequalities will emerge, but you can still have a broad society of equals with narrow inequalities between these three dimensions.
And so the basic idea being that we humans certainly have this despotic inclinations. Anybody who reads history or looks around will realize that there are sometimes maybe a minority of bad bullies and narcissists, or just in general people, when the opportunities emerge, are not unlikely to use it to gain status in these hierarchies. But we also have this, not only a possibility, but I think if I'm reading your argument and Bohm's argument correct, we have the inclination to fight against it when somebody tries to do this. So when there are, especially in the kind of classic hunter-gatherer sense, when there is someone, Bohm has these stories about when somebody tries to kind of start to amass wealth or power or whatever, and they're just ridiculed against. It's like, what are you trying to do? I mean, come on. Or in some instances, when that doesn't work, even has these reports of the band member just ganging up and ostracizing, even in some case, violently, the kind of alpha bullies. And this leading into the typical hunter-gatherer, nomadic hunter-gatherers leading a very different life than many other primates that we observe. I mean, I guess in a modern society, we've come to resemble the chimpanzees more, but it's very, very different from the typical nomadic hunter-gatherer case in the way that there is so little tolerance of this kind of alpha behavior in the human case.
Yes. So let's step back a little bit and work through Bohm's theory, because I think he has very profound insight into human nature and the core dispositions that enable us both to live in hierarchy and to live in a system of egalitarian social relations. So Bohm argues, first of all, that because we descended from a common ancestor with chimps, which are despotic beings, we share some of their despotic tendencies. And keep in mind that there's actually a complementary pair of dispositions. One is the desire to dominate others, to order them around, to push them around, right? But the other is a disposition to submit, right? And that's how hierarchy gets created among the primates, right? Is that you have competition among the males primarily. They're jockeying for position. And it's not just the bigger, tougher ones that become the alphas, because you can also have socially shrewd primates, chimpanzees, who can build coalitions with each other. And through these friendship groups, they can actually topple the biggest, toughest primate and bring their popular friend up to the alpha position. And then the alpha then endows his friends with superior positions as well.
It sounds pretty familiar.
Yes, exactly. Of course, the whole system works because, you look at the people with the power, either because of sheer physical force or because there's a coalition of guys who are going to beat you up if you don't submit. And so you're going to submit, right? But on the other hand, we also resent submission. Why? Because it's humiliating, because it deprives us of access to material resources, and because we want our independence. We want our autonomy. We want to do stuff on our own, not have to submit to, somebody else's bullying. And it's that desire for freedom, for autonomy, for self-direction that is a core motive behind egalitarianism. But how do we achieve that? And this is where I think Bohm really connects up with the history of political philosophy. So he argues that human beings, we inherited these three dispositions: to dominate, to submit, and to resent submission. But we also developed through millennia of living as hunter-gatherers. We evolved language, foresight, long-term planning. We can anticipate over the long term and not just what was going to happen in the next few minutes. But most importantly, through language and the ability to form coalitions, we were able to construct social contracts. That is, agreements among ourselves to follow particular rules of behavior or norms. And so he's hooking up to the very rich and deep tradition in political philosophy of social contract theory. And this is the part that I find most exciting. He argues that hunter-gatherers have crafted an ingenious social contract, basically to live as equals. And we have to think of the social contract in terms of norms, social norms. They agree to certain egalitarian social norms. Everybody knows what the norms are. They expect other people to follow those norms. And if they don't, right, then they're going to face various sanctions, which could range from ridicule all the way up, right? If you have like a sociopath in the band, like the group is just going to kill them because it's their only way they could get rid of these people. But usually they stop short of that. But they could do something like, if they have some bully who's constantly abusing people, they might decide to secretly decamp in the middle of the night. And now the guy is abandoned, which is not a good position to be in.
The top wake up.
So they have other sanctioning tools as well. They could just ostracize the person. Right. And so they'll allow them to be present in the band, but they won't have any conversations. They won't pal around with this person. They'll only offer the most minimal interactions needed for survival. And that social isolation is a profound punishment. And usually it makes people fall back into line. But the critical issue, everybody has to be on board, or the vast majority of people have to be on board with enforcing these egalitarian norms. So the deep story is that equality is the product of a kind of social agreement that we agree to enforce, as is, by the way, social hierarchy. So what I love about this is it gives a kind of human nature grounding in the bivalent possibilities for human beings, that we can both live as equals and in hierarchical social orders. We have the capacity for both. And that leads us to the deep question, which egalitarians have to answer, which is, now that we're out of the hunter-gatherer mode of social organization, how can we construct an egalitarian social contract so that we don't have to suffer from domination?
Yeah. And so that the social egalitarian movements that many of them we're very familiar with, whether abolitionism or feminism, etc., are social movements that in a complex, high population density complex environment such as the one where we live in are channeling the same egalitarian impulse that leads the band members to pack up their stuff in the middle of the night and leave the bully alone in order to maintain that egality so that they wouldn't end up in that demeaning position of being subordinates.
Exactly. It just turns out to be much harder to pull off a really egalitarian social contract under complex,
Yeah.
social orders than in a hunter-gatherer system.
Yeah. By the way, before we go into that, there's a couple of points of interest when it comes to the natural history and social history of humanity that I wanted to touch. But one is that, I don't know if you ever heard about this, but I can't remember where. I think in several sources, I've noticed people mention that one of the possible reasons why humans evolved to this direction is the use of projectile weapons and spears. The idea being that if you are fighting just with your fists or with something like a rock in your fist, even if you have a coalition of people, there's always one person that has to take the first risk of approaching the bully.
Yes.
Whereas if you are able to throw rocks, for example, then it's much easier to camp, kind of, become a band of equals against this bully, everybody with a rock in their hand. And none of the individuals has to kind of stand up as that first person to engage in fist combat. And that will be one of the reasons in our natural history, linked to bipedalism, for example, why humans kind of ended up on that trajectory, unlike chimpanzees. I don't know if you've ever heard about that, if you have any thoughts on it.
I've heard about that. I find that very plausible. Military technology, right? It's the great equalizer. And it's one of the reasons why women have been able to enter the armed forces, modern armed forces, to a much higher degree, right? You don't need brawn anymore.
Yeah, guns. Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah.
And in fact, I think if you look at conservatives in the United States these days, are complaining about the woke army because there are so many women and they accept gay people and trans people and so forth in the armed forces in the United States. And you have the feeling of a crisis of masculinity. There are attacks on the Ukrainian army, which is about 10% women. And they claim it's weakening the armed forces. But, the Ukrainians are fighting the Russians, who are 100% male, pretty well.
Interesting. I did not know that difference. That's very interesting.
Yes. And, part of it is brains versus brawn. Brains win in a high-tech army.
Yeah. So you do want to get the best brains, not just the biggest muscles. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I guess that's one of the reasons why in all the myths, not all the myths, but it is very typical to associate ancient female warriors with the use of the bow, for example, or
correct.
Or anything else than a big sword, which requires a lot of upper body strength. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So if you look at hunter-gatherers, one of the great equalizers is hunting dogs. So in the Philippines, I can't remember the name of the group, but in the Philippines, there's a hunter-gatherer group that hunts with dogs, and that's equalized men and women. Women can hunt big game with the assistance of dogs.
Fascinating.
And so given that the great prestige comes from hauling in a huge amount of meat that everybody feasts on, right? Women have actually greater equality in those societies than in many other hunter-gatherer bands. Or maybe it was Indonesia. I can't remember.
Okay, fascinating. Another point about the really big view of history that I wanted to pay attention to is that there is often this misconception that it's like, okay, we hunter-gatherers, 100% egalitarian, then immediately with the emergence of anything else, you're just like stuck in this like eternal oppression. And it isn't quite as simple as that. I mean, I don't know if you read Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wengrow.
Yes.
I just finished it some time ago. Fascinating book. I think they make a big deal out of this. One of the things they do talk about is that there are cities that archaeologically it appears to be very egalitarian, early cities. That's fascinating. I love those examples. But one of the things they bring a lot into the discussion is egalitarian tribal societies. And I think they sometimes bring it in. It almost sounds like they bring it as if this would be a completely new thing. I mean, it's obviously not a new thing, but it's something that people haven't always recognize, but you also use the work of Kent Flannery and Joyce Marcus, who actually make this point very explicitly, that in the last 10,000 years or so, when we've had this much more stable climate, much higher population densities, and all sorts of political organizations start to appear, it is actually in so-called tribal societies you often still find a very strong egalitarian status. This will be, I guess, a lot of the Native American tribes, for example, that people might be familiar with, would also on many ways be still very egalitarian. And so it's not just nomadic hunter-gatherers, but also many tribal people.
Yeah, I mean, we have to put in a lot of caveats here. So hunter-gatherers themselves, they are egalitarian at the band level, but not necessarily in domestic family relations. You still see male domination, men over their wives. Right. And that varies across hunter-gatherer groups. So the best you can say is, right, there's a spectrum here on gender where inequalities might be very minor, as in this group that hunts with dogs, or they could be quite large, actually, at the level of domestic, relations. But it's also the case that we do observe very important forms of equality in tribal societies and in early cities. And this is also really important. There's another theorist, David Stasevich, who wrote this wonderful book called The Decline and Rise of Democracy, A Global History from Antiquity to Today. And Stasevich argues that democracy is actually vastly more widespread. Indeed, is almost a default mode of governance in ancient times. And he argues that it wasn't, we shouldn't assume that like ancient Athens invented democracy. His view is that we see democracy all over the place in the ancient world. It's actually pretty much the default mode of collective governance. The transition out of hunter-gatherer societies. Hunter-gatherers at the band level, they deliberate democratically. But in fact, it's quite possible to scale this up, and it was very widespread. He argues that autocracy emerges when the governing or administrative apparatus becomes self-sustaining and able to select its own members.
Interesting, yeah. And it's not just ancient history, I guess. It's also in many tribal people in the early modern era. You find remarkably democratic norms, and it was chapter 2 in The Dawn of Everything, which is like, even if people don't want to read those 600 pages, it is a long book. I would just urge everyone to read chapter 2, which is about the origins of Enlightenment values in Europe, where they make...
It's a wonderful chapter, yes.
It's incredible, yeah. And to summarize, the argument is that it's not a coincidence that right after Europeans starting to engage in also trade, sometimes genocide, but first also other kinds of conversations with these tribal people in North America, many of whom had very high level of democratic norms and almost no tolerance for being bossed around, that you suddenly start then seeing in European philosophy these ideas about freedom, equality, etc. And I was really convinced by the argument.
Oh, I think it's a wonderful argument. So we have to be careful, though. Okay. So it is the case. I think they really strongly make the case that we have these recorded debates or discussions that French Jesuits had with Native Americans in North America. Their discussions and debates were written down and published in multiple volumes and were wildly popular across Europe. So they're extremely well read, these debates. And what they found was the Jesuits were shocked because when they had political discussions about politics and society, the Native Americans were looking at the Europeans and were just appalled. Firstly, that how could these Europeans so lack any personal pride that they were willing to submit into these hierarchies? And they despised Europeans for utterly lacking any concept of dignity, autonomy, freedom.
Yeah.
But they also despised Europeans because when they started creating settlements, they observed radical inequalities of wealth, such that some people were so poor that they were, starving. I mean, barely existing. And they were shocked because in their societies, the idea was you have to take care of every member of the tribe. They found that shocking.
Yeah.
How could they be so cruel and callous, these Europeans?
Yeah.
Now, I have to say, though, that I wouldn't argue that the origins of these ideas of freedom and equality, it's not like Europeans got them entirely from indigenous sources. These ideas have been around in European philosophy too, but that critique and the sharpness of it, I think, massively bolstered
Yeah.
the egalitarian critique within Europe and energized it. The other thing that I think is very important that we find in Bohm and also in Dawn of Everything is that they're very attuned to the deep connection between freedom and equality. The only society of equals is a society of autonomous people, free people, right? That is, that in contemporary political discourse, freedom and equality are often cast as opponents to each other. Oh, we have to give up freedom if we want equality. But in fact, these are very deeply joined and interconnected. If we understand a primary mode of inequality to be relations of domination and subordination, that is simultaneously a form of inequality, right? Some, the top people ordering the bottom people around. But it's also a lack of freedom for the subordinates, right? If you are dominated, you were both treated as an inferior and you lack freedom. So freedom requires that when individuals have personal autonomy so that they can live lives that they see worthwhile for themselves, not have to obey somebody else's orders about how to live. And that when collective decisions have to be made, we make them collectively and not just have a tiny number of people or maybe just one person decide how the whole group has to live.
I think that's a great moment to start bridging then more towards modern egalitarian movements. I just want to say one more time, I really highly recommend chapter 2 in Dawn of Everything for everyone. I think
agree. It's a wonderful chapter. Everybody should read it. It's inspiring.
Yeah. And I think that it just demonstrates how Eurocentric our ideas about enlightenment have been in a way that is actually really counterproductive, even for those who want to maintain these supposedly European values, because it's one thing if you just teach enlightenment as this, like, oh, and then the lights went on in Europe. It doesn't sound very plausible or very inspiring, especially for those people for whom most of their history Europeans were the big problem. But if we do see it as Europe being suddenly this nexus of global ideas where this critique of inequality flows in from North Americas, where the critique of aristocratic power flows in from China, and then these ideas start to kind of bounce around and in imperfect formulations then take root. I mean, it's significantly more inspiring.
Oh, I agree completely. Well, and there's another thing I think that's worth stressing here. Another thing that shocked the Jesuits was just how good debaters the Native Americans were. They were really smart. The reason why is that if you are in a tribal formation where all decisions have to be made collectively, then of course you're going to get politically very shrewd. And there's this beautiful passage in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, in which he's arguing for the fundamental equality of talents. So he thinks any inequalities of talents that we observe is actually due to deprivation of education and the confinement of people to like minimal tasks, like factory labor. And he points to indigenous peoples, and he says, look, if you look at, tribal societies, what you find is that everyone is skilled in all of the tasks needed to survive in that society, including political discussion. And so he actually says, actually, these people as individual sort of specimens of humanity are vastly more talented than the typical European, right? Who's confined to some lowly mechanical task and is deprived of any participation in political life. It was part of his critique of the factory system that it debased human beings by depriving them of opportunities to develop and exercise a wide variety of talents. But that we do have, everyone is endowed, almost everyone is endowed with a wide variety of talents. He says it's obvious because, you look at hunter-gatherers, tribal societies, and they're all exercising like a huge variety of talent.
Yeah, great anecdote. Well, let's move on then to egalitarian social movements. And I think one of the interesting thing that you point out, and I think very convincingly, is that it's often in opposition to rather than in favor for that these movements become organized. You're right, quote. Egalitarian social movements and the egalitarian impulse have always been oppositional forces in human history. They have been defined more sharply by what they oppose than by what they embrace, unquote. And at least if I read correctly, this is not in any way necessarily a problem. I mean, it can be a great thing. It can make them these creative impulses that always have to be reimagined in every new social context. But it does lead into the question of, well, where are we then going? Because it's so much easier. I mean, you see it very well in economic debates nowadays. It's so easy to find problems within our economic system. And it's so much more difficult to find what exactly is the sustainably better outcome. And I think one of the things I really like about your discussion on the origins of various kind of egalitarian movements is this idea that there are really two impulses. One is this kind of freedom from bullies. I want to be free to do what I want, personal autonomy. I don't want anyone to be bullying me. And on the other hand, you have the kind of freedom to control the bullies, or like to the extent that we have do we have decisions, I want to be participating in them, et cetera, et cetera. And these are to some extent united, but they can be teased apart as impulses. And if only one of them is taken super seriously and applied across the board, we end up in an extreme, which is either a kind of anarchist, perhaps libertarian extreme, or a kind of communal direct democracy. Every single thing is voted extreme, which do have problems.
Yes.
As extremes. I'm paraphrasing, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Of course, so the big thing is egalitarian thinking is at its absolute sharpest in critique. And we can see this. Actually, it goes back to Bohm, who's very insightful about this, because he traces the root of egalitarian motivations to the resentment of domination. So it's already, you can see a kind of critique built in there, right? You see something wrong. And then equality is really the outcome of a social contract, right? We have to agree, we make an agreement to adopt a set of norms and laws through which we treat each other as equals. We accord each other equal respect, right? We equal decision-making power over decisions that have to be made collectively, right? And equal standing, like everybody counts in decision-making. And that in turn requires a broad equality of access to material resources. None of this is mathematically precise, right? And so some inequalities are allowed, but just not so extreme as to create hierarchies of domination, esteem, and standing. So it's all about how do you design that social contract? And of course, the more complex society becomes, the more complex our system of rules has to be to sustain a society of equals. And that's the challenge before us today. And so thinking about collective decision-making, right, what we're observing today is some of the failures of representative democracy as a mode of equality. There's massive corruption, right? We've found, I think, with increasing economic inequality, that representatives are too easily bought by the rich. It's a big problem, right? And so one of the things that democratic theorists are looking at today is an alternative model is citizens' assemblies. Just sort of random, you just randomly select ordinary people. Now, it's hard to have them for a full legislature, but one theorist at Rutgers, Alex Guerrero, has advocated single issue citizens' assemblies. So maybe you constitute an assembly just to say, figure out what to do about the roads, right? Or, public transportation or something like that. And give them a single issue to deliberate about.
But hold on, can we hold on there for a moment? Because I think that this distinction between two opposite extremes of egalitarianism is very important and very informative. Because let's say that there is a citizen assembly, which is a kind of example of this kind of taking the possibility of kind of positive freedom to engage, this kind of democratic engagement idea of egalitarianism to the extreme. In a sense, it's still, let's say that I wasn't elected to the citizen assembly and they make a decision that then puts on a law and binds me into the law. That is from this other point of view where I don't want to be told what to do by anyone, which we can see in anarchism and libertarianism. It is almost it's almost the opposite. Like, wait, this random collection of people just telling me what to do. Like, I don't want to be paying for these roads. I don't even use the roads. Or if we make it much more serious, let's say that I'm an anti-vaxxer and they decide that everybody has to be vaccinated. Well, that's I will be very upset from that anarchist libertarian position. Or like now they are imposing this necessity for me to have some biological substance in me, etc. And just to be clear, I'm not endorsing these arguments. I'm just kind of trying to sketch the map where we are.
Yeah.
And I think that to notice that there are really these almost two extremes where we could take these and that they are not nearly as compatible as they might look like if we just focus on the criticism. I think it's very, very informative.
Right. And the difficulty with libertarians is, look, they think that they understand law as solely a matter of constraints on individual liberty. When in fact, there's two sides to laws, right? A good law is going to constrain certain liberties in order to open up other liberties. Okay. And if you open up more important liberties, then it's a good law.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think COVID is a great example where it is because of mass vaccinations that you're able to then start having schools operating normally without grandparents being killed because of that with the virus.
Exactly. Or even like the classic illustration is traffic lights. Well, I don't want any traffic light to tell me I can't go through this intersection, except that if you don't have traffic management like stop signs and traffic lights, and you have accidents and you also get gridlock in highly dense cities, and then nobody can move anywhere because you're in gridlock.
Yeah.
Right. And so, we all accept the constraints of traffic laws in order to actually enhance our freedom of movement.
Well, we should, but I have to say, not necessarily about traffic lights, but I happen to know the grandson of a psychologist in Finland the psychologist of whom was very strongly campaigning for speed limits on Finnish roads in, I think, 70s, 80s.
Uh-huh.
Just a complete no-brainer from our point of view. Even if somebody pulls up Germany, well, they have speed limits almost everywhere. They don't have a national speed limit, and but they have speed limits. And in Finland, it was especially about this kind of narrow countryside roads. And he got death threats for the rest of his life.
What, for advocating speed limit?
I guess this is one of the things I'm trying to say is that it gets really tricky when people don't see it that way, because you and I seem to agree.
It just reminds me of there was this libertarian experiment that took place in New Hampshire, which was seen as a kind of haven for libertarians. Like, maybe if enough libertarians went out there, they could take over the state because it's so tiny. And they set up this community of libertarians. But the thing is that they're living out in the country. There's a lot of bears there. And, if you end up feeding bears become very dangerous to human beings, because then they expect food. And so then they act like they own the place, and they start tearing up people's homes and getting into the garbage and stuff. And there was this disagreement. Well, how dare you stop me from feeding the bears? It's what I want to do. Only the thing is that then the community becomes unlivable because it's dangerous. Bears wandering around demanding food from everybody and threatening their lives.
Yeah.
So the whole
Yeah.
libertarian experiment fell apart. I mean, these
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
not stable. A total anarchy isn't really stable at scale.
I want to stick to that point actually a little bit longer. Two thoughts. The first one is that you described, I think, a fascinating kind of narrative rooting libertarianism into the American experience. Um, could you talk a little bit about kind of what would have been the era when we came as close to possible to genuine libertarian experience, at least for white American males in certain states?
Yeah, so let's keep in mind, of course, that in the US context, you always have to put that super big caveat that it's really just, it's right. It's a simultaneously libertarian and egalitarian system, but for only for white men. So the critical thing about the settlement of North America was that if you could take over the land from Native Americans, the land was virtually free. And in fact, President Lincoln ran on a campaign. He was both anti-slavery. He wanted to stop the extension of slavery into the territories and eventually get rid of slavery altogether. But he also advocated the Homestead Acts. The Homestead Acts decreed that anybody who just wanted to go out west and settle would get a free farm. If they farmed it for 5 years, it was theirs. They didn't have to pay any money for it. You just give away capital. And the ideal, the libertarian ideal underlying this was universal self-employment. Everybody is their own boss. They have their own plot of land or their own piece of capital to work. And then they don't have to be bossed around by anyone else. It's a deeply egalitarian impulse as well as a libertarian one, which confirms Bohm's idea that the source of egalitarianism is resentment of domination and a desire for personal autonomy.
Yeah. And I think it's important that this was in the states where slavery did not exist. So this was not a right for anyone, especially the Native Americans whose land was just taken in these acts. But that it was not, that this was more in the northern states, or the states where slavery did not exist, where this kind of small farming became the norm.
Correct. That was very important too, because down south where you'd have individuals who would own hundreds of slaves, obviously you had massive property inequality. And indeed, the people who were so poor that they couldn't afford slaves in the South were both despised and pushed to marginal lands and just treated horribly.
And the argument that you made, if I read it correctly, is that, well, first of all, this was just a completely unsustainable social experiment because it required this constant appropriation of land, which the land, first of all, is not infinite, but it also isn't exactly an egalitarian in toto when you're taking it from the Native Americans. And so that there is this kind of historic impossibility of continuing that trend. But I think what was really insightful for me also was that this is an ideal that most libertarians of today have abandoned, because a large part of this vision was near universal self-employment, of there not being bosses.
Yes.
And that's not something libertarians have focused all their efforts on there not being government, but they haven't, or at least government, except for some minor roles. But they haven't really returned in mass to this idea of universal self-employment, and they are completely happy with the kind of very hierarchical private governance, as you call it, that we find in modern corporations.
Yes, exactly. So I think that, yes, libertarians, for the most part, have lost the original libertarian impulse and now are kind of apologists for plutocracy.
But what about if you would make, I mean, I think nowadays you almost see this trend in some areas towards self-employment being the norm. You see it in high-paying IT consultants who, instead of having a job, just have their own consulting company. They go for 7 months here to do the thing. You know, they don't they don't get wages. They get an invoice. And you see it at the very bottom of the income distribution. You see in, Uber drivers. I mean, this has been a very hot topic. This idea of like, well, they're not Uber employees, they are entrepreneurs who send their invoice to Uber.
Yes, there's a couple things to be said about that. One is just the incredible cultural durability of the ideal of self-employment. Americans are obsessed with it, right? A huge percentage of Americans, if you ask them what work system would be best. They all want to be their own bosses.
Yeah.
They want to be self-employed. But we also see that the emergence of gig workers, in fact, is a product of the profit maximizing corporation. So they want to shed employees as much as possible, because if you're in an employment relation under the law, you have to pay all kinds of benefits and so pay Social Security taxes, right? So it's an economic strategy known as the fissured workplace to shrink the number of formal employees just to the core employees that are minimally necessary to run the corporation. And the corporation then gets focused on the portions of the work where the profits are really being made. So that would be around patented things and the brand name. And so that means is that the gig workers are actually tossed into the precariat. It's not a great thing to be self-employed in the modern capitalist economy, except for, yes, there are some elite workers who can manage that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm quite happy being self-employed at the moment, but I don't think wouldn't necessarily count as the very top of elite, but neither am I. Am I quite an analogous for an Uber driver who has a family to feed?
Yeah, exactly. It's a very precarious existence for those Uber drivers.
I agree. I guess what I'm trying to do more generally is that I think sketching out the kind of problems of what just taking one of these egalitarian impulses, using it as a criticism of anything that seems to violate it, how that is not necessarily always the productive road forward either. So just to kind of recap, I guess the problem in just taking this, I don't want to be bossed around by anybody mentality is that, well, first of all, it's only worked in the kind of case where you have basically infinite supply of growing land mass, which is not the kind of basis where we can or want to build an economy nowadays because of moral concerns, obviously, but also because it just doesn't practically work for infinite. Second, if you really do make self-employment the norm, you actually end up in this kind of systemic oppression that you can see in the Uber driver case, which is that it doesn't really solve the problem of not being somebody's employee if you are so dependent on the salary that you basically you have to do what they're telling you. It's not really more freedom to be self-employed low earner than being an employed low earner. And then one of the things we didn't touch upon yet is also the problem of how do you control bullies and narcissists in this kind of anarchic context, because you say that, well, I don't want to be bullied by anybody. But in order to take down an emerging bully, you have to also build these coalitions. You see it so clearly in the hunter-gatherer case, but then the more general sense is how do you encounter organized crime if you don't have any kind of organized public safety apparatus?
Right. In fact, what happens is under anarchic conditions, you get gangs. And the gangs, they organize for self-protection, but they're also tyrannical over their members.
Which is, I think, and it would be wonderful, and I really hope that if any listeners have some very nuanced, genuinely anarchic libertarian thinkers who really address all of these worries, please send them my way. I am not pretending like in this 1-2 hours that we will be able to comprehensively address every single nuance, but those would be the worries that we encounter if we just move with that. I don't want to be told what to do by anyone. What about the other extreme? So what about taking the kind of communal, participatory communalism to its very extreme? What kind of problems do we find, or challenges do we find there?
Yeah, so you could take a look, for instance, at the history of utopian socialism, where there were hundreds of experiments. The first half of the 19th century United States was a very fount of experimentation of utopian communities. And again, the reason is that land was available practically for free. And so, right, it's easy to set up these communities. And there's very little social control out on the frontier. So people could experiment with alternate lifestyles, often involving things like polyamory, for instance, which of course was socially disapproved. But if you're out in the frontier, like, nobody could really stop you. And so that there was just founts of wild experimentation in egalitarian living, but it was too comprehensive because people lived and worked in the same community. And right, they're with the same group of people. And The difficulty is that if you're living in a giant commune, you have to adjust your behavior and habits to many, many more people than if you're just in a cabin, say, with your family members. And that requirement to adjust to the needs and tastes of more and more people can feel really suffocating. Uh, and, there were famous cases. Nathaniel Hawthorne, an American novelist, actually wrote a satirical novel based on his experience in one of these communes that was set up by the father of another famous American novelist, Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women and other sort of young adult novels. Her father was one of these utopians who persuaded Nathaniel Hawthorne to join one of these communities. But her father was also just utterly incompetent. That was actually quite typical of these utopian communalists, is that they're full of ideals, but didn't know how to farm.
Yeah, yeah. So would it be right to say that if we don't take the anarchist libertarian route, but we take the communal, I guess the terms are a bit slippery. Some people would talk about some anarchic communalism and then it gets very slippery. But if we just paint with a broad brush, if we take the opposite route of not saying I don't want anyone to tell me what to do, but to say that no, I want us all to tell everyone what to do, but we want to do it together.
Right.
And the problem is, at least, well, even to the extent that the communes might work, does become very difficult to scale that.
It's a scale problem, but also it's just suffocating to have to adjust your behavior constantly to so many people. There are cases of people, for whom communal living, a large number of others, is something they really enjoy, but it's very far from a universal taste.
Well said. Well, what do we do then? Because the one way to address these problems is to say that, okay, well, we want equality. Without any doubt, the most important equality is equality of the means of production, the fruits of production. We've noticed that this kind of completely unhierarchical organization doesn't achieve it necessarily. Well, let's just assume now that we have cleared the table for the future generations. And then, well, that leads into what all the major experiments in communism look like, which is the idea that we will have a very hierarchical organization of where they're like a totalitarian organization almost, but with the purpose of this hierarchical organization being able to cater to the material equality that the people want. I don't again assume that we talk 10 minutes and we're able to tell everything that needs to be said about communism. But what as a philosopher, not just looking at what exactly was the problem in Yugoslavia or whatever. Why is it not as simple as making that work?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, the obsession with material equality and in a strict or arithmetic sense, without paying attention to the other dimensions of equality, which have to do with esteem and autonomy, is just a disaster. I don't even find it actually egalitarian. If you have to have a totalitarian, authoritarian government to establish absolute material equality in terms of our consumption possibilities, right? You're not in an egalitarian society. You're in some kind of totalitarian society. And also, I think this obsession with material equality forgets really what the deeper egalitarian impulse is. So in the end, it doesn't matter so much minor material inequalities that are far short of what would create, say, esteem hierarchies or some kind of plutocracy, are really not much to be worried about.
I also think there's an interesting point just psychologically that I'm not really convinced that most of the people working for the communist revolutions were in any sense interested in reaching that material equality imposed from the top. I mean, in the Finnish instance, for example, I'm not an expert on the Finnish Civil War. We had a whites against the Reds Civil War in 1918, but the kind of the source that most Finnish people learn about it is just one of these fantastic historical novels, really on par with War and Peace, in my opinion, called Under the North Star, Täällä pohjan tähden alla, by Väinö Linna. It's a fascinating book, and I really recommend it to everyone who's in for this really long pieces of historic literature, historic fiction. But what's really fascinating, it's told from the point of view of the farmers who join the Reds, who really are in the center of the attempt to overthrow the existing system. And well, in Finland, it did not end up succeeding. In many other countries, it did. They were driven by the exact impulse we just discussed in regards to libertarianism. They didn't want to have to take orders from the landowner.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
They wanted to have their own land. And there's this wonderful moment where there is this hardcore Marxist lecturer who comes from the capital, comes from Helsinki, and he's lecturing them. And then at some point he says, you guys, you are not real communists. And then one of them says, hey, how dare you say that? We are the ones who know the true oppression. We till the soil of someone else the whole day, etc. And then the hardcore Marxist looks at this person and says, yeah, but who are you going to vote for once you get your own patch of land?
Well, it's so interesting because it's the universal impulse of farmers that they want their own land.
Yeah.
It's absolutely universal. They cannot stand, right?
Yeah.
They don't want to work for a landowner.
Yeah.
And they don't want to live in a commune either.
Yeah, and it's not a coincidence, I think, historically, that all the major successful communist revolutions, they were not where Marx predicted them to be, which is in the industrialized state. It was all in the agrarian states, Russia, China.
Yeah.
It was, and it was typical, and this was why Mao was able to become the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, was exactly because he did the heretical thing of saying that it is the peasants that will be the force of our revolution.
That's quite right. But there's this wonderful documentary film called The Longbow Trilogy. It's an astonishing film. It's three documentaries that were filmed in like the 1960s or maybe even the 1950s. An astonishing thing that these Western documentarians actually had access to this Chinese farming village. And what they find was that the peasants absolutely resisted collectivization.
Yeah, yeah.
And they couldn't stand it. They all wanted their own autonomy. And so you would have Communist Party cadres coming in and telling them, this is how you have to divide the land. And here you're going to be growing rice. And over here, you're going to be growing whatever. And the peasants knew that these cadres knew nothing about agriculture and that they were plotting out where to grow what crops on inappropriate land. And so they're all shaking their heads, nodding like, okay, we'll do it as you say. And then they tore up all the markers and went back to the way that they had always farmed.
Yeah. And that was not enough to save those. We don't know the exact numbers, but it might be as high as 30, 50 million people who died in the 59, 60 famine.
Oh, it was a disaster. And then, of course, the initial move out of the communist system, of course, was to liberate the peasant farmers.
Yes, yes.
By giving them long-term individual leases. And that led to an explosion in, the agricultural sector. And it was only later that they industrialized. But the early reforms, which were very successful, were in agriculture.
That's fascinating. I was going to say that exact same point because I think that's somewhat misunderstood sometimes about the Chinese experience is that it wasn't from Mao to making iPhones.
No.
That what really mattered was that 1978, 1979 period when the agricultural reforms were being planned. And that really saved China from another famine that was probably coming up, according to my sources.
I wouldn't be surprised. But a big thing also was that the farmers recognized the desperation for more variety in food. So I have my best friend from high school was living in China. During the period of the reforms, and she said, in Beijing during the winter, before the reforms, the only things that you could eat were white rice, white steamed buns, white peeled apples, and white cabbage. It was like the most boring diet in the world. And then she experienced the agricultural reforms, which liberated farmers to decide what they were going to grow. And suddenly you saw an explosion of color. They're growing every kind of green vegetable, multicolored peppers. Like they're just like an explosion of variety, which of course is also, we know, very important for adequate nutrition. It's not just a matter of calories.
Yeah. And what a beautiful, beautiful also metaphor for the experience that it probably was for the farmers themselves.
Yeah, and for the consumers.
Yeah. No, this gets now into very much the weeds, and we can get back to the big picture. But I do want to ask you one thing, because I'm quite familiar with the Chinese story, because I studied this in my master's, and I lived in China. And many of us are very familiar with the Soviet story, and it often, unfortunately, is told kind of as these are the only two. But we had a lot of other experiments in Europe, and the one that often comes up as the one that was least dystopian to some extent was the Yugoslavia experience. Do you know anything about what this? Because they had worker determination to some extent in some of the factories. I mean, I really haven't studied this, but I have heard as Yugoslavia maybe being like the one place to look in where communism didn't really screw it up quite as bad as it did in some ways. Have you read about you read about the Yugoslavia experience? Do you have anything to say about it, or should we just bracket it out immediately
Yeah,
once
sorry,
I brought?
I don't have any knowledge really about how that worked. I
Okay.
mean,
Okay. Well, that's a topic for another episode. I need to find a Yugoslavia expert and see if they can they can shed light on it.
yeah, if you ask me what I think is, the most promising model forward for, modern economies, I really think we have to revive social democracy.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's the most egalitarian system that works at scale consistently with democracy, right? Democracy is deeply embedded in the whole model. And that's why I think one of the most interesting egalitarian thinkers these days is Thomas Piketty. And his work, Capital and Ideology, is just a real eye opener. I recommend it. Of course, it's, more than 1,000 pages. So,
Hmm. Well, but he has a new, very short book. He has the was history of equality, which is I think a easier place to start.
that's an easier one to start with. That's correct. But the whole story he tells in Capital and Ideology, you see the whole picture, and it's quite stunning. And what he's mainly arguing for is just a reinvigoration and expansion of our political imaginations of what, alternative possibilities are open to us.
Hmm. Well, let's talk about social democracy. I think it would be interesting to go through some of the actual examples that you think countries could learn from each other, because I come from Finland, which many people would regard as a kind of like a social democratic role model. But there's many countries that do these things much better than we do. Do some things much better than we do. So, for example, co-determination in Germany,
Yeah.
I think is a really fascinating idea. Which the fact, by the way, that it works in Germany should convince anybody who's really concerned about industrial policy that it's not a complete disaster, because Germany is probably the role model of successful industrial policy in the West. And so could you talk a little bit about co-determination? First of all, like what is it in practice in Germany, but also more generally, what do you think that like how far could this idea be taken to various directions, to make it not just about Germany and what to vote for tomorrow, but more generally as a kind of template for future egalitarian ideals?
Yeah. So co-determination is a mode of management of corporations that is joint between workers and representatives of the capital owners. And so it's not full worker owned cooperatives. And I think worker cooperatives are also a great idea, but they're a lot harder to pull off. For one thing, you have to raise the capital. But the idea is that you'll have, at the board level, at the level of, the highest level management, you'll have a corporate board of directors, which will have representatives from both labor and capital. In existing systems, capital always has a slight edge over labor, so they could always outvote labor. But where the directors are divided on the capital side, then workers actually have substantial say. One of the things that Thomas Piketty argues is that more seats should be given, a majority of seats should be given to representatives of the workers. And then they would, have the biggest say. But then you really have workers involved in management at the lower level too, not just at the highest level strategic decisions. If anything, it's more important to have worker management at the shop floor level where day-to-day decision making is undertaken regarding the work process, and also things like scheduling of particular workers when they show up for work. And that happens at the shop floor level. And there too, you have works councils where management of the shop floor is also joint between representatives of the shareholders and workers. And so it is a more kind of cooperative system. There's a very interesting political theorist, Isabel Ferraris, who has elaborated a more comprehensive theory of co-determination. So on her view, you should have something like a bicameral system where at the board level, workers would form, one branch of the corporate legislature and representatives of shareholders, the other branch. And any big decision would have to pass both houses. It's a really interesting system, and she has a wonderful theoretical account of why that would be a better way to organize.
It sounds like a good idea overall, because often, I mean, Piketty himself, I think I've heard him make this point that in many cases, the workers have the long-term economic health of the company in mind. If you have reflectively voting worker,
They want to keep their jobs.
but in order to keep the jobs, if they want the company to make long-term strategically good decisions instead of just looking at the quarterly reports, which is the problem in the capital owners only voting. So there is that kind of, I think there could be even a synergistic effect. Whereas in the wage negotiations, it feels like it's more just like a fight in a sense. So I think that's something that, for example, Finland should definitely look into learning from Germany. But I think the problem is, and this is a very genuine criticism that would come from the capital side, would be to say that, well, a country is all well and good giving majority voting rights to the workers. But if I am a manager of a wealth fund, let's say I'm in charge of the pension fund of these people, my goal is to make sure that the fund has the kind of returns that I get paid and these people have a pension. And I decide between two companies, and in one of them I get a say in how the company is run, and in the other one the workers get to say, well, I'm not going to be investing in the one where the workers have all the rights. And so even like leaving aside billionaires, etc., as long as you don't completely overthrow the system and go, China, Yugoslavia, in the communist era, you will have this kind of dynamic where it's just very difficult to make convincing and sustainable case where, as long as people depend on capital, well, the capital owners will have a say. As long as the capital owners will have a say, there will be this dramatic inequality that Marxism tries to address, and you can't really address it without just overthrowing the system. And then that could be used either as an argument against trying to tweak the system too much because it will backfire. That's the capitalist argument. Or used as a full-blown socialist argument to say, look, like you can tweak it as much as you want, but fundamentally you have to burn the system, or it's not really going to change anything. So, what do you think of that dilemma?
Well, I don't believe in burning the system down before we have a viable alternative model. And in general, I think you can't replace everything all at once. That you're just walking into disaster. So I'm in favor of incremental experimentation. And the way co-determination laws work is you mandate it for companies at a certain scale.
Yes. And I think that's really important, because I was working in a coffee shop recently, and I was quite torn about these issues, because I was like, on the one hand, I didn't like everything that the coffee shop was doing. Like basically there was no recycling, although it looked like there was. Some of the products were great, some of them weren't. I would have loved to have a little bit more say, and I would have loved the managers to be more, asking me. But at the same time, I always knew I'm going to be there for like a few months while I'm trying to get other things going. It was someone's passion project. They put their savings into it.
Nobody is proposing co-determination for these small shops, which are the passion project of the founder.
Yeah, that's I think why it's important.
Yeah, I mean, and it's very important to preserve room for small entrepreneurs. There's just like a large number of people for whom this just is their passion. They have a vision for what they want to offer. They care about that.
Yeah.
Right. And nobody should stop them. So Piketty, for instance, in his proposal for co-determination, thinks, well, look, workers should have some say, but you could give way more votes to the founder because they've invested like their whole person in it. And they're not just somebody who's like, has a job for half a year or something. And he recognizes that difference. But workers should still have some say because, I think Modern capitalists underestimate the degree to which workers actually have creative ideas for how to improve the process. And also that workers actually very commonly care about doing a good job.
I guess we should approach the end at some point soon. Before we do that, I we've been talking a lot about egalitarianism, and you have sketched not a perfect full model, but a kind of direction with some inspiration in what kind of direction to move to. But on a more philosophical, more theoretical level, I do want to ask you about your criticism of the way that many perhaps self-identified social democrats think about this, because a standard way in which many would say that how should we think about equality is that, well, we have this problem in which we don't want to have full material equality. We want to have private farmers who have their own patch of land and they can experiment, and we have these passion projects and etc. So what we really want is we want to have equality of opportunity together with a social safety net that makes sure that really tough luck doesn't completely screw your life. And you've written a really fabulous essay called What's the Point of Equality, where you said this is the wrong way to think about equality.
Yeah. So, my dissertation advisor was John Rawls. And Rawls had a very important critique of the welfare state as a kind of safety net thing. And Rawls argued that the key in thinking about distributive justice wasn't just having a safety net, but rather ensuring that people have access to enough wealth and income so that they can be autonomous, so that they can, lead their lives according to their own lights. And that's much higher than a safety net, which basically is like, pretty low. And that's why he thought it was important that people have a share of wealth and not just income. Wealth gives you a lot of opportunities and freedom that just an income doesn't. You can buy a house.
You can say no to a bad job.
You can say no to a bad job. It just gives you a lot more autonomy to run your own life. So he thought it was important to also, talk about wealth. The other thing, of course, that Rawls is famous for is advocating limits on the top, not just raising the bottom, but limiting the top. And his fundamental argument for that comes straight out of Rousseau. And basically his argument is that if you allow inequalities of wealth and income to get too large, the rich will just buy off the politicians. And I think recent experience has confirmed the worry that excessive inequality just leads to plutocracy. So in the United States today, really the rich are calling all the shots. Inequality is way too large. And even if a majority of people want something, the fact that a few billionaires don't want it and lobby intensively against it often means that these things are defeated. So yeah, we shouldn't have billionaires. They're bad for society. They undermine the welfare of the vast majority of people through their control of the political system, and they fundamentally corrupt the system.
And I think what's important in your argument here is you say that a lot of the traditional arguments are made kind of with the language of pity and envy, like we should pity these people that, oh, look how horrible it is for them, and then the billionaires, oh, we should envy. Like we have the right to envy people who have too much. And so it's not about this atomistic materialist kind of envy. And it's not pity that these people even want, whether they are in poverty or they have a disability or something. They don't want pity. They want the possibility to participate in the civil society. And that's what we need to make sure that everyone has.
Exactly. And limits at the top are not about envy. They're about securing democracy.
And so would it be right in terms of material policies, you would be advocating for, first of all, very high progressive taxation and something like what Piketty suggested, like not universal basic income, but universal basic inheritance, where everybody is just given a large lump of money.
We definitely need sharp limits on how much any individual can inherit. That'd be important. step.
And I think what Piketty's idea is really fascinating, that everybody should get, I don't know, is it like 60,000 or 200,000 or something, but like a large lump of money when they are
Yeah.
when they are young adults, so that everybody has the kind of wealth which allows them to participate in the way that middle class people, like upper middle class people, can participate in a civil society. And they do get nice, and they can be self-employed and have fun while being self-employed, but you're not going to be having fun if you have zero wealth and you're on a very low payment.
Yeah, that's right. Now, as far as the configuration of income goes, I mean, basic income might be part of it, but I think there are a lot of complications involved in designing an optimal package of social welfare benefits. I wouldn't necessarily prioritize basic income because there's a lot of other things, like children have special needs and so forth. It's complicated to design the package. I'm not opposed to a basic income, but I wouldn't necessarily prioritize it because there's so much else that needs to be done.
Should parents who stay home to look after children get a wage from the society, from the government or whoever?
Well, I do think that a universal child benefit would be a very important part of the package, right? And then caretakers can decide, maybe they will use that to enable themselves to stay at home with the kids, but they might use it for other purposes, childcare, lessons for the kids, whatever.
Well, one last question on this front before we start wrapping up is that now we've talked a lot about money, taxation, money, wealth, etc. But you've also underlined earlier that it's not just about the economic equality. There's something more, and you write in several places that there's too much focus on material equality in a lot of these discussions, and too little on what you call democratic equality.
Yeah.
Sometimes like relational equality. Just as before we wrap up, could you give your pitch on what does that mean? What's the difference in focusing on just how much possessions each individual has versus thinking about it relationally in terms of relations and democratic participation?
Yeah. So relational equality, which I think is the foundational kind of equality, refers to how we relate to each other, right? Number one, are some people ordering other people around in unaccountable ways? Do they have unaccountable power over others? Relational equality says no, nobody should have that. Number two, what about esteem inequality? Are some groups despised and stigmatized? Like, that's wrong too. We want everyone to enjoy a foundational equality of respect, and to radically pluralize the dimensions of esteem so that everyone can find, a place, some mode of exercising genuine virtue that gets admiration.
And this is why just giving money to someone and saying, "Oh, poor you," and giving them a check does not solve the problem, because...
Right. Because it's all really about esteem. And indeed, if you read the great egalitarian theorist Rousseau, in his discourse on the origins of inequality, and he asks, why do we have so much wealth inequality? His foundational answer, which I find highly plausible, is that people are desperate for superior esteem over others, right? And they recognize that people will admire you if you are wealthy. And so they're grasping after mounds of property and wealth just to get admired. And in fact, Smith agreed with Rousseau on this point.
And there we have the impulse to rise up in the despotic hierarchy, but we also have the opposite side, the resentment of being at the bottom of it.
Yep.
And therefore the impulse to continue the fight and with creatively and apparently not with a completely 100% full platform given by us now on how to do it, but keep on finding ways.
Yeah.
Well, before we end, one final question. Based on all of your reading, based on all of your thinking, what would you say, what kind of animals are we?
Well, we contain multitudes, right? We can be despotic, we can be egalitarian. And, I think we're better if we are egalitarian. We're all better off. So that's what we should strive for.
Professor Elizabeth Anderson, thank you very much for taking the time.
It's a pleasure to speak with you.
And thank you for listening this episode until the very end. I really enjoy recording, editing, and doing all the work that goes into these episodes. I hope that you enjoy the product. If you do, then I would really appreciate a helping hand. It can be something as simple as giving a nice review on your podcast app, sharing it with a friend, or if you haven't done so, just subscribing. That really helps immensely at this early stage of building the show. Whatever you decide to do, I hope that you decide to tune in the next time. Until then, take care.